Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, talking about the new A24 horror movie, Heretic, in theaters now. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So don't look now, but Hollywood might be in its religion era. I think with this, an influx of just a ton of faith-based movies recently, and then also some several buzzworthy, more mainstream films like Conclave, the entertainment just seems to be exploring spiritual themes in several, I think, very interesting ways. And Studio A24's latest horror movie, Heretic, really joins that ongoing religious dialogue, albeit with a bit more of a skeptical bite. I think despite a very effectively unsettling atmosphere and a very captivating performance by actor Hugh Grant, Heretic is unfortunately just undone by approaching its, I think, intriguing theological questions more as a one-sided lecture rather than a stimulating dialogue. And the film is built around the premise of two young Mormon female missionaries who make a house visitation to the seemingly outwardly jovial Mr. Reed, who is played by actor Hugh Grant, only for the tables to quickly be turned against them as it begins to pepper them with just challenging questions to their faith. While the movie's third act ultimately does fall back into more traditional horror territory of jump scares and bloody violence, really most of Heretic actually plays out more as a psychological or theological thriller. And the very uncomfortable backdrop of two young ladies alone in the house with an older and clearly psychotic man does infuse the story with sort of ever-present tension. But really most of the horror in this movie revolves around the woman having their religious faith called into question. It seems according to this film, the most horrific threat is not things that go bump in the night, but rather it's the lingering doubt of whether your entire worldview is in fact built on a lie. And overall, I think Heretic is an entertaining enough film. I think this is very well crafted and it is sufficiently creepy. I think all three of the main cast members in this movie are great, with Hugh Grant as the clear standout. And it's just a very delicious role for the veteran actor to totally act against type, against expectations, in a more villainous, sort of deranged role of a psychopath. He's just very soft-spoken and even charming and witty in ways that just seem to make him even more unsettling. I also just found Heretic to be kind of a difficult film to predict where it will go next, and that its focus on the more psychological torment rather than just body horror and gore is just a refreshing change of pace. And yet, for all of that, the film just doesn't quite work. I think a horror movie driven by theological dialogue is unique and interesting, but it's just the way that Heretic explores that concept just feels a lot less inspiring. I think for a Christian viewer, the film is not offensive as much as it is just kind of frustrating. And it's a movie that's perhaps akin almost to the faith-based God's Not Dead series that regularly depict intelligent Christians as steamrolling, bumbling atheists with clever religious rhetoric and slam dunk proofs for God's existence, to the delight of a primarily Christian audience. Because in many ways, Heretic is just God's Not Dead for atheists, just with a bit of horror and Hugh Grant sprinkled in. The film does raise several probing questions just about religion and faith, such as how much of what we believe is merely the byproduct of our upbringing and experiences, or why are there so many similarities in the religious myths that seem to predate Jesus, or even just how as believers can we trust in divine revelation if it's inevitably filtered through imperfect human vessels. And I think all of those are very valid questions. I think the problem for me is not that Heretic raises those questions, it's just that it never appears genuinely interested in engaging in a good faith conversation about them. Hugh Grant is a compelling mouthpiece for the religious skepticism, given multiple extended monologues to really make his case. But on the other hand, the two Mormon missionaries are largely silent in this and is sort of left to stare blankly ahead as the camera zooms in on their bewildered faces. And despite the outward guise of being a more intellectual horror flick, Heretic, I don't think it's just quite as clever as it seems to think that it is. I think to me, this is more akin to the college freshman majoring in philosophy who skims through a Richard Dawkins or a Christopher Hitchens books and then just assumes that he's now equipped to, debunk thousands of years of religious tradition. And Heretic treats each of its religious objections really as just total knockout blows for religion. I do think a few of Mr. Reed, who is Hugh Grant's character, a few of his arguments are indeed challenging, with the problem of evil or just the impossibility of certainty, but most are really just outdated party tricks that have, long since been discredited by scholars to the point that even most atheistic philosophers rarely utilize them anymore. And perhaps similar to something like the Da Vinci Code back in 2006, it's the sort of attack on religion that seems really only persuasive to someone who has never exerted much energy actually studying religion. Now, as a Christian myself, obviously I would have appreciated if the pro-religion perspective had been given a more knowledgeable or articulate voice. But I think the same is true just in my capacity as a moviegoer, because really this film's sense of horror and dread is largely contingent on the audience feeling apprehension that their religious objections are unanswerable. Because after one very extended argument against religion, Mr. Reed concludes, "It's all terrifying, isn't it?" And yet it's not, as even one of the missionaries finally remarks, really it is a flimsy argument and therefore just not a very terrifying predicament. And I think as a result, I think the film's failure just to put forth many serious objections or to explore the missionaries' this internal, spiritual conflict with any real depth, this diminishes its intended effect, which is perhaps why I think the movie ultimately reverts from a psychological thriller to a more traditional horror film by the end. Although, to be fair, unlike the God's Not Dead movies, the one voice in this movie's central worldview is also the villain and clearly an unhinged individual. And also, despite struggling at times to articulate a verbal response, both of the missionaries do remain surprisingly resilient in their faith. I do think that the filmmakers were at least aiming at a more provocative, balanced theological discussion rather than just, some cheap atheistic propaganda. I just don't think they were successful in achieving that aim. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this. For language, there were maybe 2 to 3 minor profanities, as well as several other substitute words like effing or friggin' spoken by the missionary characters. For violence, really there's not a whole lot until the end of this movie, although when it does come, it is intentionally disturbing, because you have a character that has their neck slit and you see them bleed out on the ground, and other characters are just assaulted in various ways. Someone is punctured in the neck with a sharp object or hit in the face with a wooden plank that has protruding nails, or another character is stabbed in the stomach. And probably the most unsettling scenes is in which a character is kind of cutting open someone's arm to remove an implant, and you do sort of see their fingers shoving into the wound and even pulling, kind of inadvertently pulling out a vein. And lastly, as far as sexuality, there's really nothing depicted on screen other than briefly a woman has her pants pulled down as part of a prank. But there is talk of more sexual topics and things, such as this movie begins, the opening dialogue is an extended conversation about condoms, and in which a character is also describing in detail a pornographic video. There's also a man that mentions how he believes that God is watching people as they masturbate, and also claims that God hates gay people for being the way that he made them. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface of this, really this whole, as you might expect, thematically, is just about the nature of religion. At the start of this film, Mr. Reed asks, what is the one true religion? And after having studied different religions, across culture, he boldly, claims to have discovered the answer to that question, which to him is control. Where despite the external theological differences between the religions, he believes that they all have in common, just a desire and an infrastructure to gain power over people. At one point he says religion is just a system of control. And even in the opening scene of this film, kind of the two missionaries are having a conversation about the manipulative, power of marketing, leading one of the women to ask, what else do we believe just because of marketing? And the implication is that religion is just a matter of marketing, a mere business transaction where religious institutions offer people purpose and comfort in exchange for the power and control over its adherents. And kind of to that end, even Mr. Reed's entire game of psychological torment is designed to demonstrate that even our private thoughts and desires, such as religion, are in fact just determined by the will of those that are in power. And obviously how much weight audiences should give the opinion of a madman is up for debate. But even with the missionary's more positive outlook, the question never seems to be whether religion is true, only whether it's beneficial. Because throughout the film, one of those women constantly sees this butterfly, and it becomes very much symbolic of her faith. Although then in the story's closing moments, it's suggested that the butterfly is not, and perhaps never was, truly there. And that moment, as well as some that kind of unexplained events that directly preceded, which I won't spoil here, is left open to interpretation, kind of begging the question, is the experience of a miracle and evidence of the real presence of God, or is that imagined butterfly just merely a metaphor for how like the comfort from religion may be real and valuable, even if the objective truth of God is not. And in the Bible, in Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul wrote, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." The idea that if Jesus was not truly the Son of God, then there is no peace, there is no purpose to be found in Christianity. But thankfully, and despite Mr. Reed's attempts in this movie to prove otherwise, Christians can take comfort in the assurance that their faith is built on a firm foundation of truth. So in the end, I think Heretic is a disappointing film that really largely squanders its very promising concept. I think some atheists will probably appreciate its very forceful takedown of religion, and on the other hand, some Christians will be outraged and offended by its very one-sided perspective. But perhaps it is those in the middle, such as myself, who just hope for an engaging theological conversation and got a more watered-down atheistic lecture instead that will leave the theater most unsatisfied. Although, if nothing else, maybe this film can kind of open the eyes of Christians to how an unbeliever likely feels watching, any of our very heavy-handed, kind of sermonizing faith-based films. But for me, I really wanted to like Heretic more than I did, but ultimately just found it to be an unstimulating theological debate in the vehicle of an only mildly enjoyable horror movie. I think as a Christian, I definitely appreciate that Hollywood has been increasingly willing to explore spiritual and religious topics. I just wish that Heretic as a movie had more of value to add to that conversation. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys think. If you guys go check out this movie, if you're a Christian, or hey, if you're not a Christian, be respectful, but don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. Encourage you guys too, if you haven't done so, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. We'd love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.